She was an artist of the unseen. Her medium was order, her palette the quiet, efficient running of a world that was not hers, but his. Lady Alara, Duchess of Blackwood, moved through the cavernous stone halls of Blackwood Castle not as its mistress, but as its most devoted, most invisible servant. On evenings such as this, when the great hall was ablaze with the light of 1,000 candles reflecting in the polished silver and the depths of 100 wine-glasses, her artistry was on full display. She had orchestrated it all, the precise shade of cream in the damask roses, their thorns painstakingly removed by her own hand that afternoon, the subtle infusion of rosemary in the roasting lamb, a scent meant to evoke the wild hills of the north, a compliment to the visiting lord who hailed from there. The exact spacing of the chairs, ensuring no guest felt crowded, yet none felt isolated. Every detail, from the beeswax polish on the floors to the alignment of the ancestral portraits on the walls, had passed under her discerning eye. She stood now just within the shadows of a great stone archway, watching. Her gown was the color of a winter sky at dusk, a deep and quiet gray that allowed her to blend with the ancient stone. It was beautiful, exquisitely made, but it was not a color that demanded attention. It was a color that deferred. From her vantage point, she could see her husband, Duke Alistair, at the head of the long, groaning table. He was a figure carved from power, his presence as solid and unyielding as the castle itself. His dark hair was threaded with the first hints of silver at the temples, lending him an air of gravitas that his title alone already commanded. He was speaking, his voice a low, confident rumble that effortlessly held the attention of those seated near him. He was discussing the new tariffs on wool, his brow furrowed in concentration, his hands gesturing to emphasize a point about shipping lanes and profit margins. He was magnificent in his way, a force of nature, a man who bent the world to his will through sheer, relentless focus. Ilara watched the candlelight catch the sharp line of his jaw, the intensity in his dark eyes. She knew that look. It was the same look he had when reviewing accounts with his steward, when debating land rights with his solicitors, when planning the rotation of crops for the home farm. It was the look of a man entirely absorbed in the mechanics of his world. And she was simply one of the mechanics. The most intricate, perhaps, the most reliable, but a mechanism nonetheless. She saw Lord Pemberton's wife shiver, a barely perceptible tremor. The great hall, for all its splendor, was prone to draughts. Before the woman herself was consciously aware of her own discomfort, Ilara had caught the eye of a footman stationed near the fireplaces. A subtle, almost imperceptible nod of her head was all it took. The footman moved silently, adding another log to the nearest hearth, the flames leaping up with a soft whoosh, sending a wave of warmth down the length of the table. Lady Pemberton relaxed, the tension leaving her shoulders. She would not know who to thank for her sudden comfort. She would simply feel it. That was Ilara's purpose, to provide comfort that went unnoticed, to solve problems before they were ever acknowledged as problems. Alistair glanced her way once, his eyes sweeping over her for a fraction of a second. It was not a glance of connection. It was a scan. He was checking that she was in her place, a sentinel of social grace, ensuring his evening proceeded without flaw. He saw the gray dress, the calm posture, the symbol of the Duchess of Blackwood, and, satisfied, his attention returned instantly to his conversation. He did not see Ilara. He did not see the woman inside the dress, the mind behind the placid expression, the heart that beat a slow, steady, lonely rhythm against her ribs. He saw a function, and the function was being performed to perfection. This was the pattern of their life together, a tapestry woven from his grand, important threads and her fine, invisible ones. The whole picture was magnificent, the envy of the county, but only he was considered the weaver. Her threads were the warp, the silent, structural foundation upon which his brilliant colors could be displayed. Without her, his threads would be a tangled, useless heap on the floor. It was a truth she knew in her bones, and a truth he had never once considered. She remembered their first anniversary. He had been away in the capital for weeks, negotiating some vital charter for the local guilds. He had returned the very day of their anniversary, late in the evening, smelling of horse and leather and the cold night air. He had seemed tired, distracted, but he had remembered, or rather his secretary had. He presented her with a small, beautifully wrapped box. Inside was a slim volume of poetry, bound in blue leather, the title stamped in gold leaf. Sonnets of the Heart. It was a lovely gift, an appropriate gift. It was also a book by a poet she actively disliked, a sentimentalist whose verses she found cloying and dishonest. She had mentioned her preference for the stark, elemental work of another poet just a month before, a conversation she had thought they were sharing over breakfast. Clearly she had been speaking into a void. She had thanked him, of course. Her performance of gratitude was as flawless as her performance of hostessing. She had smiled, her eyes conveying the correct measure of gentle delight. He had kissed her forehead, a gesture of absent-minded affection, his thoughts already turning to the papers, waiting in his study. "I'm glad you like it," he had said, his voice heavy with the day's fatigue. He had not asked her to read a poem aloud. He had not sat with her. He had simply delivered the object and considered the obligation met. The book still sat on her nightstand, 5 years later. It was pristine, unopened. She dusted it every week. It had become a small, silent monument, a testament to the space between them, a space filled with assumptions and functions, but utterly devoid of true knowledge. He saw the book there, she knew. He probably saw it as a sign of her enduring affection for his gift. He would never guess it was a gravestone. There were countless other moments, small, quiet cuts that accumulated over the years. She would be reading in the library, a vast and beautiful room that was her only true sanctuary, and she would discover a passage of such profound insight or beauty that she felt a desperate, aching need to share it. She would wait until he was home, until there was a lull in his relentless schedule. She would find him in his study, poring over maps. "Alistair," she would begin, her voice soft, hesitant, "I read the most extraordinary thing today." He would look up, his eyes taking a moment to focus on her, to pull themselves away from the topography of his lands and onto the topography of his wife's face. "Oh?" he would say, the single syllable an invitation, but a distracted one. And she would start to explain, to share the thought that had so electrified her. But before she could finish, his gaze would drift back to the map. "Yes, that's interesting, my dear," he would murmur, his finger tracing the line of a river. "Did you happen to speak to the steward about the drainage issues in the south pasture? We must get that resolved before the next rains." and the extraordinary thought would die on her lips, turning to ash in her mouth. The moment would pass, the connection would fail, and she would retreat back to the library, the silence of the room, a comfort after the greater silence of being unheard. She used to play the piano. It was a beautiful instrument, a grand piano of polished rosewood that stood in the west drawing room, a room that caught the afternoon light. Her mother had insisted she learn, and Alara had discovered a genuine talent, a passion for the intricate architecture of a sonata, the emotional cascade of a nocturne. In the first year of their marriage, she had played often. She would fill the quiet afternoons with music, hoping the sound would travel down the corridors to his study, that it might be a balm to his busy mind, a call to him from another part of their shared home. He never mentioned it, not once. He never asked her to play for him. He never commented on a particular piece or remarked on the presence of music in the house. It was, to him, just another sound, like the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall or the distant call of a rook from the battlements. It was part of the castle's ambient noise, not an expression of his wife's soul. And so, one day, she stopped. She walked into the west drawing room, looked at the piano, at the silent, waiting keys, and she closed the lid. It made a soft, final sound in the empty room. She did not play again. The silence that followed was absolute, and it went entirely unnoticed. The absence of the music was as unremarked upon as its presence had been. It was the most profound confirmation of her invisibility. She was there when he signed the contracts that would make them wealthier. She was there when dignitaries from foreign courts were entertained. She was there, a constant, silent, graceful presence, organizing his world, oiling the gears of his life, and he moved through it all as if it simply happened by magic. She was the ghost in the machine of his success. The annual midsummer ball was the pinnacle of the county's social calendar and the pinnacle of Alistair's year. It was a night where he could display the fruits of his relentless labor, the prosperity of his estate, the strength of his alliances, the sheer, unassailable weight of his influence. This year was to be a particular triumph. After months of painstaking negotiation, he had secured a trade alliance with a consortium of northern merchants, a deal that would enrich not only his own coffers, but the entire region. The ball was to be its public consecration. Alara, as always, had worked for weeks to ensure its perfection. She had overseen the transformation of the ballroom into an enchanted forest, with boughs of birch and oak laced with hundreds of tiny, shimmering fairy lights. She had debated menus with the chef until they had settled on a feast that was both rustic and refined, a nod to the northern merchant sensibilities. She had selected the musicians, a string quartet from the capital, and instructed them on a program that would swell and recede with the mood of the evening. The gardens glittered with lanterns she had designed herself, their light casting a soft, flattering glow on the stone pathways. Every single detail was a thread she had personally woven into the grand tapestry of the night. She stood beside him on the dais, a half step behind, as he prepared to make his announcement. She wore a gown the color of moonlight on water, a shimmering silver blue that made her feel ethereal, almost transparent. It seemed appropriate. Alistair raised a hand, and a hush fell over the glittering assembly. He began to speak, his voice filled with pride and satisfaction. He spoke of hard work, of perseverance, of the bright future his new alliance would bring to Blackwood and its people. "This success was not achieved alone," he boomed, his voice resonating with sincerity. "I must extend my deepest gratitude to my steadfast adviser, Lord Harrington, whose counsel was invaluable." He nodded to a portly man who beamed, and to my tireless steward, Mr. Blackwood, who managed the estate with unmatched diligence in my absence. A thin, wiry man bowed his head. Alistair went on, thanking his solicitor, the guildmasters, the captain of the port. He even gave a hearty thanks to his horse breeder for providing the swift mounts that had carried his messengers. The crowd applauded warmly at each name. Alara waited. She held her breath, a small, foolish hope fluttering in her chest. She had been there for every late night, every moment of frustration. She had been the one to talk him through his doubts, to review the finer points of the contracts with him, pointing out a clause he had missed, suggesting a turn of phrase that would be more palatable to the proud northern merchants. She had been his silent partner in every sense. He finished his speech, raised his glass in a toast, and the hall erupted in cheers. He had not mentioned her. He had not looked at her. In the story of his great triumph, she was not even a footnote. The foolish hope in her chest died, and a familiar cold stillness took its place. Later, the festivities were in full swing. Alistair was holding court, surrounded by a circle of admirers. Alara watched from a distance as a woman she did not recognize, a visiting dignitary named Lady Isolde, engaged him in conversation. Lady Isolde was everything Alara was not. She was vivid, dressed in a gown of shocking crimson, her laughter loud and throaty, her gestures bold and theatrical. She touched Alistair's arm as she spoke, her eyes glittering with a challenging, flirtatious light. And Alistair was transformed. He leaned in, his eyes alight, a genuine, unguarded smile on his face. He was animated, engaged, alive in a way Alara had not seen him be with her in years. He was not discussing tariffs or crop rotation. He was laughing at a joke, his head thrown back. He was seen, and he was seeing. The knot in Alara's stomach tightened. It was not jealousy, not exactly. It was a profound and hollow sorrow. This was the man he could be. This vibrant, present man was the man she had thought she was marrying. Lady Isolde, perhaps sensing a rival, or perhaps just wishing to solidify her own position as the center of attention, turned her bright, predatory gaze on Alara as she drifted closer. "And you, Duchess," Lady Isolde said, her voice carrying, drawing the attention of the small group. "It must be so restful to live in this magnificent castle. But tell me, what does one do with all one's time here?" The question was coated in a thin veneer of polite interest, but the subtext was clear. "You are an ornament, a kept thing. What is your purpose?" Alara opened her mouth to form a reply, some polite, self-deprecating murmur about managing the household. But before she could speak, Alistair laughed. It was a fond, dismissive sound. "Oh, my wife is a creature of quiet habits," he said, turning his charming smile upon Lady Isolde, a smile that included her in a private joke at Alara's expense. "She ensures the clocks are wound, I suppose." A few people in the circle chuckled politely. It was not meant with malice. It was a throwaway line, a piece of casual, thoughtless wit from a man basking in his own glory. But for Alara, the words landed like stones. "She ensures the clocks are wound." He had taken the entirety of her existence, the endless, invisible labor, the emotional support, the intellectual partnership she had tried so desperately to offer, and reduced it to a piece of minor, mechanical housekeeping. He had held her up to this crowd, to this sharp-eyed woman, and declared her utterly, comically insignificant. He had erased her, publicly, completely. She did not flinch. She did not cry out. She held her composure like a shield. She even managed a small, tight smile, the ghost of an expression. But in that moment, something inside her, something that had been slowly cracking for years, finally shattered. It made no sound, but it was a tectonic event. The final straw had not been a grand betrayal, but a small, quiet, public humiliation. It was the realization that he did not just fail to see her. He did not even know what there was to see. Later that night, long after the last carriage had rolled away and the castle had fallen into a heavy silence, Elara sat in the velvet armchair in her bedchamber. The moonlight gown lay pooled on the floor where she had let it fall, a shimmering, empty skin. She wore a simple white dressing gown. She was not crying. The capacity for tears felt like a distant memory, a language she no longer spoke. The hurt and the anger that had churned within her during the ball had burned away, leaving behind a vast, cold, and unnervingly peaceful clarity. She stared at her own reflection in the dark glass of the window. A pale, solemn woman looked back at her, her features indistinct in the gloom. The jewels of the Duchess of Blackwood still glittered at her throat, a heavy, cold weight against her skin. She saw a stranger wearing a costume, a ghost haunting a life that was not her own. For years she had tried to be seen, to be valued for the woman she was behind the title. She had offered up her thoughts, her music, her care, her love, and it had all been received as part of the service, like the polishing of the silver or the winding of the clocks. He had given her the answer tonight. He had defined her, a creature of quiet habits. Very well. A profound, unshakable decision settled into her soul. It was not a decision made in the heat of passion or the throes of anger. It was a decision forged in the cold, clear light of absolute truth. She would not fight him. She would not cause a scandal. She would not write a furious letter and flee in the night. That would be a performance, and she was done with performing. Her decision was much quieter, much more final. She would simply withdraw. She would remove the one thing she still had absolute control over: her presence, her effort, her silent, constant, invisible support. She would accept the role he had assigned her. If she was a creature of quiet habits, then she would finally have those habits for herself. She would go somewhere he could not see her, somewhere she was not a function or a symbol, and there, in the quiet, she would finally set about the task of seeing herself. She reached up and, with steady fingers, unclasped the diamond necklace. It fell onto her dressing table with a soft clatter. The sound was a period at the end of a very long sentence. The next morning, while the castle was still yawning and stretching, clearing away the last vestiges of the ball, Elara sat at her small writing desk. The sun cast a pale, watery light into the room. She took a single sheet of heavy cream paper, the ducal crest embossed at the top, and uncapped her ink. Her hand was perfectly steady as she wrote. The note was not addressed to Alistair, it was addressed to His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood. It was brief, formal, and devoid of any emotion. It was a request, not a demand. "Your Grace," she wrote, "I request your permission to take up residence in the old gardener's cottage on the eastern edge of the estate by the Whisper Wood. I wish to undertake its restoration as a personal project. I trust the running of the household is in capable enough hands to manage in my absence." She signed it simply, Elara, Duchess of Blackwood. The gardener's cottage had been derelict for 50 years. It was a crumbling stone husk, roofless in parts, choked with ivy and briars. It was the most forgotten place on the entire vast estate. To request to live there was, on its face, an act of profound eccentricity. But Elara knew it was the only place she could truly disappear. It was a place with no history of her as a duchess, no expectations, no functions to perform. It was a blank slate. She sent the note with a young footman who looked at her with wide, curious eyes. She then began to pack. Not the gowns of silk and velvet, not the jewels, not the feathered hats or the embroidered slippers. She packed 3 simple, sturdy dresses of plain wool and cotton. She packed her worn gardening gloves, a small trowel, and a book on medicinal herbs. She packed the novels by the poets she truly loved, their spines cracked, their pages filled with her own annotations. She packed the things that belonged to Elara, not the things that belonged to the Duchess. It all fit into a single, modest wooden trunk. Alistair was in his study, nursing a headache from the previous night's wine, already deep in correspondence regarding his new trade alliance. The footman delivered Elara's note on a silver tray. Alistair read it, his brow furrowing for a moment. The request was bizarre. The gardener's cottage? He had a vague memory of it as a ruin you passed on the way to the best hunting grounds. He considered it for a moment. His wife had been even quieter and more withdrawn than usual lately. Perhaps she needed a hobby, a distraction. Restoring an old cottage seemed a harmless enough, if baffling pursuit, for a woman of her station. It would keep her occupied. Frankly, it was a relief. It solved a problem he hadn't fully articulated to himself. The low-grade, persistent guilt he sometimes felt at her silent presence. The vague sense that he was failing some duty he couldn't quite name. If she was happily engaged in some rustic project, that duty was fulfilled. "Very well," he said to his secretary, who stood waiting. "Draft a reply, as you wish. Grant her whatever she needs from the estate stores for this project of hers." He dismissed the matter from his mind before the ink was even dry on his own letters. It was a trivial domestic issue, and he had far more important things to attend to. Elara received his reply, a single curt line on a piece of paper. "As you wish." She had expected nothing more. It was permission. It was release. She did not wait for a carriage to be brought around. She did not require an entourage. She had her small trunk sent ahead with a stable boy. Then, wearing a simple brown traveling cloak, her hair tied back in a simple knot, she walked out of the grand, echoing entrance of Blackwood Castle. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, watched her go from an upper window, her expression grim and knowing. A few maids curtsied as she passed, their faces a mixture of confusion and pity. But no one of an importance saw her go. Alistair was in a meeting with the guildmasters. The great doors of the castle closed behind her, and the sound did not even register in the chamber where he sat, planning the future of his domain. The first day of her absence passed. Her place at the long dinner table was empty. Alistair noted it with a brief internal nod. She was at the cottage, he supposed, getting settled. The first week passed. He ate his meals alone or with his steward, the silence in the vast dining hall feeling spacious, peaceful. He found his thoughts were clearer without the small, unspoken obligation to make conversation with her. He mistook the absence of her presence for the presence of peace. He believed she was content with her new folly, and that her contentment served his convenience. It was the perfect arrangement. He had a wife, but he did not have to be a husband. The weeks began to bleed into one another, turning into a month, then two. Alistair's life, on the surface, continued its triumphant trajectory. The Northern Alliance was proving even more profitable than he had imagined. His name was spoken with respect in the capital. He was a man at the zenith of his powers, his world ordered and productive. He barely thought of Alara at all, picturing her, when he did, as a kind of rustic dilettante, happily playing with stones and weeds. But a subtle, insidious decay had begun to set in. It was not a rot he could see, not a problem he could solve with a directive to his steward. It was a loss of grace, a slow unraveling of the invisible threads that had held his world together. He hosted a dinner for a visiting magistrate. The flowers on the table, arranged by a young, well-meaning maid, were a garish clash of colors, stiff and formal in their vase. They looked like flowers for a funeral. The meal was technically perfect, but the sequence of dishes felt slightly off, the wine pairing not quite right. The conversation, which Ilara had always so skillfully guided, moving from one guest to another like a bee pollinating a garden, now faltered. There were awkward silences. He found himself having to work, to consciously steer the discussion, a task he had never had to perform before. The evening felt clumsy, heavy-footed. It was a success, but a joyless one. He started to notice things, small things, a persistent draft in the gallery of portraits that he had never felt before. He found the source, a heavy velvet tapestry which had always hung perfectly straight, was now slightly askew, letting a sliver of cold air slip past the window frame it was meant to cover. Ilara had always ensured such things were perfect. He went to the library one evening, searching for a specific historical text, a book on Roman fortifications. He spent an hour searching the shelves, growing increasingly frustrated. He knew they owned it, but the library's impeccable order seemed to have softened, to have lost its crisp, intuitive logic. Ilara would have been able to walk directly to it in the dark. She had held the entire library in her mind. The house felt wrong. It was still clean, still orderly, still grand, but its soul had gone. It had become what it was made of, stone, wood, and glass. It was no longer a home. It was a monument, and he was rattling around inside it like a dried pea in a drum. The silence he had at first welcomed now seemed to press in on him. It was no longer peaceful. It was empty. He walked past the west drawing-room one afternoon. The door was ajar. Sunlight streamed in, illuminating dust motes, dancing in the air. The rosewood piano stood in the center of the light, its lid closed, its surface gleaming. But the silence that emanated from it was no longer passive. It was an active, accusing silence. He found himself remembering the sound of her music, faint and beautiful, drifting through the house on long-ago afternoons. He had never acknowledged it, but he realized now, with a jolt of something like panic, that he had been listening, and he missed it. One evening, he was standing in that very room, his hand resting on the cool, smooth lid of the piano, when Mrs. Gable the head housekeeper, entered silently. She was a small, bird-like woman with eyes that missed nothing, and she had served the Dukes of Blackwood since she was a girl. She did not dissemble or flatter. It was not her way. She stood for a moment, watching him. "The house misses its heart, your grace," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Alistair stiffened, irritated by the familiarity, by the implied criticism. "The house is functioning perfectly, Mrs. Gable," he said curtly. "See to your duties." "My duties have included, for the past 7 years, watching her grace hold this place together with her own 2 hands," the housekeeper replied, unruffled. She remembered every servant's name and the names of their children. She sat up all night with Mary from the laundry when her little boy had the fever. She saw to it that the leftover food from your banquets went to the poorest families in the village. That is the heart of a house, your grace, not polished floors and punctual meals. She gave a small, stiff bow and departed, leaving him alone with the silent piano and her scalding words. He wanted to be angry, but a cold dread was beginning to seep into his bones. The final blow to his ignorance came a week later at the county's autumn hunt. He was riding beside Lord Ashworth, a neighboring landowner with a penchant for gossip. "Heard the most peculiar thing, Blackwood," Ashworth said, his voice laced with amusement. "Heard your Duchess has taken up residence in that old ruin by the Whisper Wood. Thought it was just a rumor, but my wife swears by it. Says the woman's performing miracles. Turned that old briar patch into a garden the likes of which haven't been seen in this county for a generation. The whole county is talking about it. They're calling her the Lady of the Garden." Alistair felt the blood drain from his face. He had imagined her playing at being a rustic, getting her hands a little dirty, arranging a few potted plants. He had pictured her bored and waiting for him to summon her back. He had not, for one single moment, imagined her succeeding. He had not imagined her creating something so remarkable that it had become the subject of county-wide gossip and admiration. She had built a world without him, a world where she was not his quiet, clock-winding duchess, but the Lady of the Garden, a title she had earned, not one she had married into. He realized with a sickening lurch that he had no idea who his wife was. He had no idea what she had been doing for the past 4 months, and for the first time he was terrified he had lost something he had never understood he possessed. While Alistair was slowly waking to the emptiness of his castle, Ilara was immersed in the fullness of her new world. The gardener's cottage, when she first arrived, had been even worse than she remembered. It was a skeleton of a house, a stone shell open to the sky in places, the floor a mulch of damp leaves and broken pottery. The air was thick with the smell of decay and neglect. For a moment, standing in the derelict doorway with the wind whistling through the empty window frames, a sliver of despair had touched her, but it was quickly replaced by a fierce, unfamiliar resolve. This ruin was hers. Its restoration would be her own. The first weeks were a blur of brutal, unaccustomed physical labor. She hired an old, semi-retired stonemason from the village, a man named Silas, whose hands were as gnarled as ancient tree roots. She did not command him. She asked for his help. She paid him from the small purse of her own dowry money, a sum Alistair had never thought to inquire about. Together they patched the holes in the roof with slate they salvaged from a collapsed barn. She learned to mix mortar, her soft hands becoming chapped and calloused. She learned the heft of a roof tile, the satisfying thud of it slotting into place. She spent days on her hands and knees, scrubbing the grime of 50 years from the stone floors, using sand and vinegar and sheer, stubborn effort. This was not a noble woman playing at being a peasant. It was a deeply intelligent, capable woman, applying the full force of her focus, a focus she had previously expended on guest lists and menus, to the elemental tasks of survival and creation. She plastered the interior walls herself, her movements slow and inexpert at first, but growing more confident with each day. The work was exhausting. Her muscles ached in ways she had never imagined. But at the end of each day, when she looked at a newly sealed roof or a smoothly plastered wall, she felt a sense of profound, clean satisfaction that none of the perfect banquets had ever given her. She was not arranging beauty, she was building it. Once the cottage was habitable, a simple, watertight space with a fireplace that drew properly and windows that kept out the wind, she turned her attention to the land. The garden was a formidable opponent, a tangled, thorny wilderness of briars, nettles, and strangling ivy. She began in one corner with her small trowel and a pair of sturdy shears. She worked methodically, clearing a small patch of earth each day. She dug out the stubborn roots of the brambles, her back screaming in protest. She sifted the soil through her fingers, removing stones and weeds. She discovered the ghost of the old garden beneath the chaos, the faint outline of stone-lined beds, a gnarled ancient apple tree that still clung to life, a hardy strain of climbing rose that had survived half a century of neglect. She tended to this nascent garden with the same meticulous, loving care she had once wasted on Alistair's social life. She planted vegetables, sturdy rows of carrots and lettuces, sprawling pumpkin vines, tall, elegant beanstalks. She planted herbs, not for grand banquets, but for her own small kitchen and for their scent and healing properties, lavender and chamomile, thyme and sage. And she planted flowers, not the formal, stiff damask roses of the castle, but a joyous, chaotic profusion of cottage flowers, hollyhocks and delphiniums, foxgloves and poppies. The colors were a riot, a celebration. They were not for show. They were for the bees and the bees for her. They were for the bees and the butterflies. They were for the sheer, unadulterated joy of it. Her life settled into a simple, quiet rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. She woke with the dawn, her first act to step outside and breathe in the smell of damp earth and growing things. She spent her days in the garden, her hands in the soil, feeling the warmth of the sun on her back. In the evenings, she would sit by her small fire, reading the books she loved, their complex poetry, a conversation with a kindred spirit. She cooked simple meals for herself on the hearth, a soup made from vegetables she had grown, bread she had learned to bake. The silence of the cottage was not an emptiness, it was a presence. It was filled with the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind in the trees, the sound of her own, even breathing. She was no longer invisible. In her withdrawal, she had become more visible than ever before. The villagers, at first wary of the strange duchess in their midst, began to see her not as a title, but as a person. They saw her walking to the village for supplies, a basket on her arm, her dress simple, a smudge of dirt often on her cheek. They saw the miracle she was working on the old garden. The vicar's wife, a kind, practical woman, was her first visitor. She did not come to pay her respects to the Duchess. She came to offer a pot of jam and to ask for advice on blight affecting her roses. They sat on a simple wooden bench in Alara's garden and had a real conversation, a talk of weather and soil and the small joys and sorrows of village life. Alara began to trade her surplus vegetables with the villagers, a basket of her tender lettuces for a few fresh eggs, a handful of her fragrant herbs for a slab of bacon. She was no longer the Duchess of Blackwood, a remote and untouchable figure in a stone fortress. She was Alara, the woman with the astonishing garden, the woman with the quiet smile, and the dirt under her fingernails. They did not see her rank. They saw her work. They saw her. And she, in turn, began to see herself, not as a reflection in her husband's eye, not as a functionary or an ornament, but as a woman capable of creating life and beauty from ruins, a woman who could stand on her own 2 feet on a small patch of earth that she had claimed and nurtured as her own. She was not waiting for Alistair. She was not thinking of him at all. She was, for the first time in her life, simply and completely content. Driven by Lord Ashworth's gossip and the gnawing unease that had become his constant companion, Alistair finally decided to act. He would go to the cottage. He would see this miracle garden for himself. He would assess the situation, formulate a strategy, and fix it. He thought of it in the same terms he would a border dispute or a failing crop. It was a problem to be managed. He rode out on his finest black stallion, a creature of impeccable breeding and immense power, a projection of his own status. As he neared the eastern edge of the estate, he saw it. The rumors had not been an exaggeration. Where he remembered a dark, tangled blot on the landscape, there was now a pocket of impossible life and color. A low stone wall, neatly built, enclosed a garden that spilled over with a profusion of flowers and vegetables. A thin curl of smoke rose from the cottage chimney, and the cottage itself was no longer a ruin, but a snug, welcoming stone dwelling, its windows clean, a climbing rose with vibrant crimson blossoms reaching for the newly thatched roof. He was so taken aback by the transformation that he almost rode past. He dismounted, his polished riding boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. He felt like an intruder, a creature from another world. He found her on her knees in a vegetable patch, her back to him, carefully weeding around a row of young carrots. She wore a simple blue dress, faded from the sun, and a wide-brimmed straw hat. He saw the smudge of dark soil on her cheek that the villagers knew so well. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her focus entirely on the earth in front of her. "Alara," he said. His voice sounded loud, intrusive in the peaceful air. She finished pulling a stubborn weed, placing it carefully in a basket beside her. Before she turned, she did not startle. She simply looked up at him, her eyes shaded by the brim of her hat. And in that gaze, he saw something that stopped him cold. There was no deference. There was no fear. There was no lingering hurt. There was only a calm, quiet, and utterly unnerving assessment. She was looking at him as she might look at a stranger who had wandered into her garden. For the first time in their life together, he felt at a complete and utter loss. He was the Duke of Blackwood, and in this small, sun-drenched patch of land, his title meant nothing. He had, in his old, transactional way, brought a gift. He had instructed his kitchens to prepare a large, ornate box of chocolates from the capital, the most expensive and sought-after confectionery available. It was a gesture he thought was grandly conciliatory. He held it out to her now, a peace offering from his world to hers. "I brought you something," he said, his voice stiff. She looked at the opulent ribboned box. Then her gaze drifted to a small patch near her feet, where tiny, jewel-like wild strawberries grew, catching the sunlight. She looked back at him, a faint, unreadable smile on her lips. "Thank you, Alistair," she said, and the use of his name without his title was another small shock. "But I have all the sweetness I need right here." She did not take the box. His first attempt had failed. The currency of his world, money, status, grand gestures, had no value here. He retreated, confused and angry, the box of chocolates feeling foolishly heavy in his hand. His strategy had to change. If she would not accept his gifts, he would impose his help. A few days later, he dispatched a team of his best builders to the cottage with instructions to improve it. They were to add a new wing, install larger glass windows, build a proper stone veranda. He would make the cottage suitable for a duchess. He would bring her world back under the umbrella of his control, his generosity. Ilara met the builders at the edge of her garden. She listened politely to the foreman as he explained the Duke's grand plans. Then, with the same quiet firmness she had used with Alistair, she sent them away. "Please thank His Grace for his concern," she said, "but the cottage is perfectly suitable as it is. It requires no improvement." The foreman, baffled, could do nothing but retreat with his men. When the news reached Alistair, his frustration boiled over into a rare display of temper. He did not understand. He was trying to help, to provide for her, and she was refusing him at every turn. His failures, his utter inability to impose his will on this new, quiet version of his wife, forced him into a place he had never been before: introspection. He began to walk the empty, echoing halls of his castle, not as its master, but as a visitor. He saw the slightly askew tapestry, the artless flowers, the dust gathering in the corners of the library. He saw the absence of her care everywhere. He sat at the silent piano for an hour, his fingers hovering over the keys, trying to imagine the music that had once filled the space. He finally took the unopened book of poetry from her abandoned nightstand. He opened it. Sonnets of the Heart. He began to read. The verses were sentimental, just as she had known. He remembered, with a sickening clarity, the breakfast where she had spoken of her love for another poet, a conversation he had dismissed as trivial. He had not listened. He had never listened. He started to see the pattern, the thousands of small daily dismissals, the constant casual erasure of her personhood. He saw her not as a duchess, but as a woman, offering him her thoughts, her passions, her very self, only to be met with a wall of distracted, functional indifference. In his despair, he summoned Mrs. Gable. He did not command her. He asked her to sit. "Tell me about her," he said, his voice rough. And the old housekeeper, seeing the genuine pain in his eyes for the first time, told him. She told him everything. She told him how Ilara had learned the names and stories of every person who worked in the castle. She told him how she had personally nursed sick servants, how she had quietly paid for the education of a promising stable boy, how she had managed the complex emotional and social ecosystem of the household with a grace and wisdom he had never even noticed. "You married a queen, Your Grace, Mrs." Gabel finished, her voice soft. And you gave her the duties of a chambermaid. The housekeeper's words were a final, devastating blow. The grief that washed over him was immense. It was the grief of a man who realized he had been living with a stranger he had created through his own neglect. He understood then. He could not command her return. He could not buy it. He could not build it. He had to earn it. And to do that, he had to stop trying to change her world. He had to change himself. He stopped trying to force his way back into her life. He began instead to watch. From a distance, he would ride to the edge of the woods and simply observe her as she worked in her garden. He learned the rhythm of her days. He saw the contentment in her posture, the peace in her movements. He was not spying. He was studying. He was trying to understand the woman he had never known. One blustery afternoon, he saw her struggling. She was trying to move a large, heavy fieldstone into place at the corner of a new wall she was building. She could barely budge it. She was straining, her face tight with effort. Without a second thought, he dismounted his horse, letting the reins drop. He walked across the damp grass toward her. She heard him approach and looked up, her expression wary. He did not speak. He simply walked to the other side of the stone, bent his knees, and wrapped his arms around it. Together, wordlessly, they lifted. The stone was heavy, awkward. Mud splattered his immaculate riding breeches and caked his expensive boots. With a final, coordinated heave, they settled the stone into its place in the wall. He straightened up, breathing heavily. She was looking at him, her chest also rising and falling with exertion. For the first time since she had left, the polite, distant mask in her eyes wavered. A flicker of something else, surprise, confusion, perhaps something more, moved across her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. He just nodded, his throat tight. He did not press his advantage. He did not ask for anything. He did not speak of the castle or of her return. He simply turned, walked back to his horse, and rode away. It was the first truly selfless thing he had done for her in their entire marriage. It was not a gift or a command. It was just help, freely given for a task she cared about. He began to visit, but differently. He would leave a small bundle of rare seeds he had sourced from a contact in the capital on her doorstep, a sign that he was paying attention to her new passion. He learned to simply sit on the low stone wall of her garden, sometimes for an hour in silence. He did not demand her attention. He just offered his presence. He was learning a new language, the language of being, not doing. One day, she came over and handed him a cup of mint tea, brewed from her own garden. She sat on the wall beside him. They drank their tea in a silence that was no longer empty or accusing, but companionable. It was a start. The seasons had turned once more. Spring had ripened into the full, lush heat of summer. A year had passed since she had walked out of the castle. Her garden was a masterpiece, a testament to a year of devotion, a riot of life that drew visitors from miles around. The county no longer gossiped. They spoke of her with a kind of reverence. She finally agreed to speak with him, not in the oppressive grandeur of the castle, nor in the formal neutrality of the village. She would see him in her garden, the ground she had made her own. He arrived not on his grand stallion, but on foot, dressed in simple, practical clothes. He looked thinner, the arrogance in his posture replaced by a quiet humility. He did not ask her to come back. He did not make demands or promises of wealth. He stood before her amidst the flowers she had grown, and he spoke the simple, painful truth. "I was a fool," he began, his voice low and steady, "a blind, arrogant fool. I had a wife, and I saw only a duchess. I had a home, and I saw only a castle. I spent years looking at you, Ilara, and I never once saw you." His gaze was direct, unflinching, and filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to have hollowed him out. "I don't know how to fix what I broke. I don't know if it can be fixed, but I am willing to learn if you will teach me." She listened, her expression unreadable. The apology was not grand or poetic. It was simple, honest, and stripped of all pride. It was the most real thing he had ever said to her. She did not offer him immediate forgiveness. That was not a gift she could give lightly. Instead, she told him what she needed. Not a title, not jewels, not a life of ease. "I need to be seen," she said, her voice as clear and calm as a still pool. "I need to be heard, not as an echo of your own thoughts, but as myself. I need a partner, Alistair, not an ornament. My life is here, now. This is real. The castle was a performance. I will not go back to that." Her terms were absolute. She would not return to the invisibility of her former life. She would not become a ghost again. He had anticipated this. He had spent months thinking about it. He did not try to argue or persuade. He proposed something new, a radical departure from the life they had known. "Then don't," he said. "Don't come back to the castle as you were. Let us build something new, together." He suggested that he spend several days a week at the cottage with her, not as the Duke visiting a tenant, but as a husband visiting his wife. He would help her in the garden. He would learn the names of the flowers. They would eat the food she grew at the small wooden table she had built. He would learn the quiet rhythms of her real life. And in return, he continued, his voice hesitant, perhaps you would consider joining me at the castle for the most important events, not as a silent hostess in the background, but as my partner, at my side. I need your counsel. I need your wisdom. I have been running half a government with half a mind for a year now. I need my queen." It was a negotiation between equals, the first they had ever had. He was not commanding her return to his world. He was asking to be allowed into hers and inviting her to rejoin his on entirely new terms. She looked at him for a long time, at the man he was becoming, a man humbled and willing to learn. She looked at her garden, at the life she had built from nothing. She was not afraid of losing it. She knew now that she carried it within her. "I will try," she said. The final scene of their old life, and the first of their new one, came that autumn at the harvest ball, the year's equivalent of the midsummer celebration that had broken her. As before, Alistair stood on the dais to address the assembled nobility of the county. But this time Ilara was not a half-step behind him, a shadow in a gray dress. She stood directly beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She wore a simple gown the color of moss green, the color of life. He began his speech, but his first words were not of harvests or profits. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers, and he spoke to her as if they were the only two people in the room, though his voice carried to every corner. "I would have none of this," he said, his voice thick with an emotion no one there had ever heard from him before. "And I would be none of this without the wisdom, the strength, and the profound grace of my wife, Ilara." The crowd was silent, stunned. "She taught me that the most important foundations are not built of stone, but of care and attention. She taught me how to see. He raised his glass, not to the crowd, but to her, to my wife. Later that evening, they were not surrounded by the usual crowd of sycophants and favor-seekers. They slipped away, walking alone through the castle gardens. The gardens were changing. Under Alara's quiet guidance, the stiff, formal beds were being softened, interspersed with wild flowers and rambling roses. It was becoming a place of life, not just of display. They walked in a comfortable silence for a time, a silence that was shared, not empty. Then Alistair stopped and turned to her. "That book you were reading yesterday," he said, "the one about the constellations. What did the author say about Cassiopeia? You said it was an interesting theory." He was not filling silence. He was asking. He wanted to know her thoughts, and she told him. She spoke of myths and stars and the poetry of the night sky, and he listened. He truly listened, his head inclined toward her, his eyes focused on her face, lit by the moon. They stood there for a long time, two people who had been lost for years in the same grand house, finally finding their way back to each other. They were looking not at the imposing stone fortress behind them, but up at the vast, star-filled sky, their hands intertwined. It was not an ending. It was a new and quietly, exquisitely earned beginning.